This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled The Middle East Since 1918. And this will be part one of this series. We'll do part two later on. Now, the Middle East is one of the most complicated areas of the world today. And this video will trace three themes in the Middle East since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. First, the role of Western imperialism in the Middle East. Second, the importance of nationalism and ethnic tensions. And third, the role of religion, especially Islam. From its beginning at the end of the 13th century through the end of the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire, which was ruled by Turks, steadily gained territory. The Turks led the Islamic world in what appeared to be yet another stage of Islamic military expansion since the beginning of Islam in the 7th century CE. The Ottomans came to dominate much of the Middle East and parts of Eastern Europe. While the majority of people in the Ottoman Empire were Muslims, it did have Christian and Jewish minorities as well. The Ottomans, at their height, even threatened lands deep into Europe. For instance, in besieging Vienna, Austria in 1529 and again in 1688. However, in 1688, Austria defeated the Ottomans at the Siege of Vienna and took Hungary from the Ottomans in the decades that followed. The Ottoman Empire steadily declined after 1688. From the late 17th through the late 19th century, the Ottomans lost territory to the Austrians and Russians, as well as to rebellious Christian peoples such as the Greeks, Serbs, Romanians, and Bulgarians. The Ottomans also lost territory in North Africa as countries there became independent. And the Ottomans fell behind the West, both technologically and economically. And this had major consequences for the Ottoman Empire. Napoleon Bonaparte led French forces in a successful invasion of Egypt in 1799, which then was an Ottoman province. France invaded and annexed Algeria in 1830, which was previously associated with the Ottoman Empire. By the 1850s, the Ottoman Empire was known as the sick man of Europe for all of its problems. As historian Bernard Lewis points out, the decline of the Ottoman Empire was humiliating for Muslims in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire had been the premier Islamic empire. And Muslims saw themselves as religiously superior to non-Muslims, or infidels. And since the Middle Ages, Islamic states had always been on the expansive. So it was painful for Muslims to experience centuries of defeat beginning in 1688 at the hands of Christian Europeans and to find themselves constantly backward economically and technologically. While several sultans attempted to reform the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, and a group of reform-minded military officers known as the Young Turks took control of the government in 1908 in another attempt to reform it, these reform efforts were too little too late. The Ottomans would enter the First World War in the fall of 1914 on the side of the Central Powers because they believed that Germany would win the war and they wanted to be on the winning side. But the Ottoman Empire did not have the industry to support their war effort. They struggled greatly in the First World War. Also, ethnic groups under Ottoman rule, such as Armenians, Kurds, Arabs, and even Greeks, revolted during the war. For their part, the British assisted the Arabs in the revolt, and the Arab revolt was very successful. Unfortunately, the Ottoman government and military massacred Armenians, men, women, and children during the war. And many other Armenians were deported to desert areas to die. Now this was a genocide of the Armenian people in which estimates vary widely, between 500,000 and up to 1.5 million people may have died. At the end of the war in 1918, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. The Greeks then invaded Asia Minor, also known as Anatolia, in a bid to protect ethnic Greeks living there and to protect their land and expand their land holdings. Fighting ensued between Turks in Asia Minor and Greeks, and this ultimately resulted in a Greek defeat and the violent expulsion of the ethnic Greek minority from Asia Minor. And this was a violent expulsion of the Greeks, of people who had lived there since ancient times. Now, Greece and Turkey have often had poor relations since the 1920s, especially in the 1970s when Turkey invaded and occupied the island of Cyprus, which at the time had a large Greek population. The modern state of Turkey was founded after the First World War. Its first and most prominent leader was Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who lived from 1881 to 1938. He would lead Turkey from 1923 until his death in 1938. Now, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was a remarkable figure. He was a Turkish nationalist who founded a new, modern Turkish state. This Turkish state and constitution was secular, with religion and politics separate, and women were given voting rights. And all of this was unheard of in a predominantly Muslim country. The Turkish language also switched to the Latin-based alphabet, also a reform that was unheard of. So Ataturk built a modern Turkish state more along a Western model. However, there is a dark side to this modern Turkish state and modern Turkish nationalism. As historian Ronald Sunni points out, modern Turkey was built on the genocide of the Armenian people and the confiscation of their land after the First World War. And to this day, the Turkish government denies this genocide and is even actively involved in suppressing scholarship to further explore it. Also, the Turkish government has attempted to impose Turkish culture and language on ethnic minorities in Turkey. The largest ethnic minority in Turkey today are the Kurds. The Kurds, who are a Muslim people that speak a Turkish-related language, Kurdish, live in parts of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And they've long struggled to gain their own independent nation state. Today, the Kurds are considered the largest nationality without their own state. Since the 1920s, Turkey has fought a number of Kurdish revolts within its own borders. Revolts that still continue today and still involve a lot of struggle between the Turkish military and Kurdish nationalist groups seeking to leave Turkey and form their own independent state. Now, what has occurred with Turkey since the First World War is a good example of the power of nationalism and ethnic tensions in the Middle East. While Turkey was founded as an independent state after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, other territories that had been part of the Ottoman Empire also fell under European rule. The British and French had made a secret agreement during the First World War in 1916 called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, named after British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat Francois-Georges Picot. The Sykes-Picot Agreement basically divided up much of the former Ottoman Empire in the Middle East between Britain, which was given a mandate, control, protectorate over Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine, and France, which was given a mandate and protectorates for Syria and Lebanon. Now, the Sykes-Picot Agreement not only included different territories for Britain and France after the First World War in the Middle East, it also included the drawing of new borders for these territories. And the way the French and British drew up these new borders for places like Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, did not take into account the ethnic and religious groups on the ground. So this effectively created artificial states whose borders did not correspond to the religious and ethnic reality on the ground. This has led to many problems in the Middle East today, as many people of one ethnic group live in several different states. Likewise, the British and French ruled these states as protectorates during the 1920s and 1930s, but granted them independence at the end of the Second World War in 1945. For its part, France also waged a bloody war with Arab Algerian nationalists in the 1950s and 1960s. This led nearly to a civil war in France until Charles de Gaulle took power in 1958. De Gaulle would pull France out of Algeria in 1962, with about 1 million French settlers fleeing Algeria for France. Now, the French dramatic war and pulling out of Algeria is an example of Europeans leaving the Middle East in a violent fashion. On a less violent fashion, after World War II, Italy granted Libya independence, which had formerly been a very important Italian colony. Now, most peoples in the Middle East believe that the end of British, French, and Italian rule of their various countries would mean the end of Western imperialism in the Middle East after World War II. Nonetheless, in 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration, which pledged support for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Now, the establishment of a Jewish nation-state in the ancestral home of the Jewish people had become the goal of some Jews known as Zionists. And during the 1920s and 1930s, some Jewish Zionists moved to Palestine. Jewish refugees from Europe, including Holocaust survivors, also came to Palestine in the 1940s. Zionists in Palestine clashed both with Arabs and with British authorities in the 1930s and 1940s, sometimes quite violently. In 1947, the recently established United Nations recognized Israel as a new nation. The establishment of Israel was seen as completely unacceptable to Arabs. Arab states such as Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon had just become independent from the British and the French, and they thought Western imperialism was coming to an end. But Israel was established around the same time, in 1947. For Arabs, the State of Israel was a renewal of Western imperialism in the Middle East, all at a time in which such imperialism appeared in their eyes to be coming to an end. So newly established Arab states attacked Israel in 1948, but seemingly against all odds, Israel won. Several other wars between Arab states and Israel followed, and these wars are called the Arab-Israeli Wars. There was fighting not only in 1948, but in 1956, in 1967, and 1973. These were all short wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors, and these were all wars that Israel won. And in each case, it took more land from the Arab Palestinians. Next door to Israel, Lebanon became a cosmopolitan, thriving nation from 1945 until 1975. Beirut was known as the Paris of the Middle East. But in 1975, Lebanon collapsed into civil war between rival political and religious factions. During this Lebanese civil war, the Palestinian Liberation Army, the PLO, a Palestinian group that was using violence to try to take back their land from Israel, took refuge in Lebanon. And this in turn caused Israel to intervene militarily in Lebanon in the early 1980s in an effort to expel the PLO, which it saw as a thorn in its side. Since 1947, Israel, which is a democracy, has become a thriving modern state, despite all of its problems with its neighbors. Israel has become a leader in science, engineering, and medicine. Israeli scientists have won 4 Nobel Prizes in chemistry, more than the entire Islamic world combined. And Israel is much smaller than the Islamic and the Arab world in population and size. As historian Bernard Lewis notes, since its establishment in 1947, Israel has widely been seen in the Middle East as a Western nation and as a tool of Western imperialism. The success of Israel, both economically, technologically, scientifically, and with their thriving democracy, is another reminder of a major problem that has vexed the Islamic world for centuries. Namely, why is the infidel West so wealthy and powerful while the Islamic world is relatively poor and powerless? And I'll continue the discussion of this issue in part 2 of this video. Thanks for watching.